When Derek Vaughan knocked on Margaret Calloway's door that Tuesday morning, he thought he had found the perfect victim, an elderly widow living alone in a quiet Asheville neighborhood, no family nearby. Predictable routines, a house full of valuables accumulated over a lifetime. He had watched her for 3 weeks. He knew she took her evening walks at exactly 6:30. He knew she struggled with the grocery bags. He knew she seemed ... helpless. But Derek Vaughan didn't know everything. He didn't know that behind those gentle gray eyes and that warm grandmother-esque smile lived something far more dangerous than he could imagine. He did not know that Margaret Calloway had spent 30 years of her life doing things that would never appear in any public record. He didn't know that certain training never leaves your body, no matter how many years pass. And he definitely didn't know that when you threaten someone who was once trained to eliminate threats to national security, you don't become the hunter, you become the prey. What happened inside that house over the next 72 hours would dismantle an entire criminal network, expose 23 victims, and prove that the most underestimated weapon in any room is the one nobody sees coming. This is the story of how a career criminal made the worst mistake of his life, and how a sleeping protocol, buried for decades, awakened with deadly precision. How does a 73-year-old woman outsmart, outmaneuver, and neutralize professional criminals? How does someone transition from baking cookies to executing counter-surveillance operations? And what happens when the past UVA try to leave behind becomes the only thing standing between you and danger? Margaret Calloway's morning began like any other in her modest 2-story home on Maple Ridge Drive, tucked into the rolling mountains surrounding Asheville, North Carolina. The autumn air carried that crisp bite that longtime residents treasured, cool enough for a cardigan, warm enough to keep the windows open. She had lived in this house for 12 years now, ever since Robert passed away and she decided the Virginia suburbs held too many memories. Asheville suited her. The city attracted artists, retirees, and people seeking a slower pace of life. The downtown area buzzed with craft breweries and galleries, while neighborhoods like hers maintained that small-town tranquility. Her neighbors were friendly but respectfully distant, exactly what Margaret preferred. They knew her as the pleasant widow who kept an immaculate garden, attended the Presbyterian church on Sundays, and volunteered at the library's literacy program every Thursday. What they didn't know could fill classified files that would never see daylight. Margaret poured her morning coffee into the chipped mug that Robert had bought her in Prague, or at least, that's what she told people. The truth was more complicated. She had bought it herself during an operation in 1989, and Robert had simply been her cover identity for that particular mission. The mug had survived 3 decades and countless moves, a small memento of a life she had promised herself she would leave behind completely. She settled into her reading chair by the bay window, picking up the novel she had been working through, a thriller about espionage that made her chuckle at its inaccuracies. Real intelligence work was far less glamorous and far more methodical than fiction suggested. It was about patience, observation, and the ability to become invisible in plain sight. The doorbell rang at 9. Margaret glanced at the antique clock on the mantel, early for visitors. She wasn't expecting anyone. Through the window, she observed a white van parked in her driveway with Secure Home Locksmith Services printed on the side, professional-looking. A man in a navy uniform stood at her door, clipboard in hand, appearing official and non-threatening. But Margaret Calloway didn't survive 30 years in the intelligence community by taking things at face value. As she approached the door, her mind automatically catalogued details that most people would miss. The van was clean, but the logo appeared recently applied, no weathering or fading from sun exposure. The uniform fit well, but the boots were casual sneakers rather than work boots. The clipboard looked authentic, but he held it at an awkward angle, like someone unfamiliar with actually using one for work purposes. She opened the door with the chain still attached, offering a warm smile that revealed nothing of her observations. "Good morning," the man said, his smile rehearsed and just a touch too friendly. "I'm Derek from Secure Home Locksmith. We're doing a neighborhood security audit following some recent break-in attempts in this area. Have you heard about the incidents on Willow Street?" Margaret had not heard about any incidents, and she read the local crime reports religiously, a habit she had never broken. "Oh my," she replied, her voice adopting that slight tremor that people expected from someone her age. "No, I hadn't heard. How concerning." "That's exactly why we're here, ma'am. We're offering free security assessments for all residents in this zone. May I come in and check your door locks and windows? It'll only take about 15 minutes. And there's absolutely no charge." Every instinct Margaret had developed over 3 decades screamed warning. The approach was textbook social engineering: create urgency through fear, offer a free solution, gain access to assess valuables and security weaknesses. She had taught courses on these exact tactics to new recruits at the farm, the CIA's training facility. But Margaret was curious now. And if this was indeed a criminal operation targeting elderly residents, she had a former professional obligation to gather intelligence. "That's very kind of you," she said, unlatching the chain. "Please, come in." Derek stepped inside, and Margaret caught the micro-expression of satisfaction that flashed across his face, the look of someone who believed their plan was working perfectly. She also noticed the slight bulge near his right ankle. A weapon, probably a small handgun. Amateur placement, too slow to access quickly, but clearly meant to intimidate if needed. Beautiful home, Derek commented, his eyes scanning the interior with an assessment that had nothing to do with aesthetics. He was cataloging the antique mirror in the hallway, valuable. The vintage record player resettable, the jewelry box visible through the bedroom door. Target. Thank you, Margaret replied. I've been here for 12 years now. Can I offer you some coffee or tea while you work? That's very kind, but I shouldn't. Professional standards and all. He set his clipboard down on the hall table. Let me start with your front door lock. These older models can be vulnerable to bump keys. As Derek knelt to examine the door, Margaret moved to the kitchen, ostensibly to give him space to work. In reality, she was accessing the small drawer beneath the silverware organizer, a drawer that contained items that had no place in a retired widow's home. A compact Cobalt tactical knife, a small canister of pepper gel rated for law enforcement use, and a modified smartphone that could do things far beyond making calls. She powered on the phone, activating its surveillance mode. Within seconds, it had identified and begun recording from the camera hidden in Derek's clipboard, a device designed to capture layout information and identify security vulnerabilities. It also detected a radio frequency suggesting Derek was wearing a communication device, so he wasn't working alone. Margaret returned to the hallway carrying a glass of water she didn't actually want, playing the role of the concerned homeowner. How does it look? Derek stood, brushing off his knees. Well, ma'am, I've got to be honest with you, this lock is pretty outdated. I'm seeing wear patterns that suggest it could be compromised with minimal effort. Same with your window latches. They're the original hardware from when this house was built, probably 30-40 years ago. 35, Margaret confirmed. Right now, I don't want to alarm you, but with the recent activity in the area, you're particularly vulnerable. I'd strongly recommend upgrading to our premium security package. It includes reinforced strike plates, smart locks with phone access. And how much would something like that cost? Margaret interrupted, allowing her voice to carry a note of financial concern. This was the setup. He would quote a high price. She would express inability to pay, and then he would either pressure her into a payment plan or, more likely given the weapon he carried, the interaction would take a darker turn. The full package runs about $3,500, but we're offering a senior discount that brings it down to. Derek's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and Margaret caught the message preview, confirmed target solo. He typed a quick response, then looked back at Margaret with a smile that had shifted subtly. The professional mask was slipping. Mrs. Calloway, is anyone else home with you? A husband, maybe adult children visiting. And there it was, the transition from scam to threat assessment. Oh no, Margaret replied, maintaining her gentle demeanor. I'm a widow, it's just me here. My daughter lives in Seattle, we mostly talk on the phone. She watched Derek process this information, watched him make the decision, watched the exact moment when he shifted from con artist to something more dangerous. He reached down, not for his tools but for his ankle, and that's when everything changed. Before you do something you'll regret, Margaret said, her voice dropping its elderly tremor and becoming something else entirely calm, controlled, absolutely certain. I need you to understand that you've made a significant error in judgment. Derek froze, his hand hovering near his ankle holster. Something in her tone had penetrated his criminal confidence. I need you to carefully remove your hand from that weapon and place both hands where I can see them, Margaret continued. If you reach for that gun, the next 60 seconds will be the most painful of your life, and you will not leave this house on your feet. For a moment, Derek looked confused. Then he laughed, a nervous sound that suggested he was trying to reclaim control of the situation. Lady, are you seriously trying to threaten me? Do you have any idea what? He didn't get to finish the sentence. Margaret moved with speed that defied every assumption Derek had made. One moment she was 3 feet away, the next her hand had struck his wrist with surgical precision, hitting the radial nerve and causing his entire arm to go numb. Before he could react, she had pivoted behind him, her arm wrapping around his throat in a blood choke that cut off circulation to his carotid arteries without restricting his airway, a technique designed to render someone unconscious in seconds without causing permanent damage. Derek struggled, but Margaret had angles, leverage, and 3 decades of muscle memory that his panic couldn't overcome. Within 8 seconds, his body went limp. Margaret lowered him to the floor. Quickly securing his hands behind his back with zip ties, she retrieved from the hall closet another item that had no business in a grandmother's home. She removed the gun from his ankle holster, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and placed the components on her mantel, far out of reach. Then she went to her kitchen and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. Derek would be unconscious for approximately 90 seconds. That gave her time to think. She had maintained her cover for 12 years. 12 peaceful years of gardening and book clubs and pretending that her reflexes were slow and her awareness was dim. She had attended retirement seminars and dinner parties and had become exactly what she had promised the agency she would become: invisible, unremarkable, no longer operational. And now this amateur criminal had forced her hand. Margaret sipped her coffee and waited for Derek to wake up. When he did, gasping and disoriented, he found himself restrained on her living room floor, staring up at a 73-year-old woman who looked nothing like a victim. "We need to talk," Margaret said quietly. "Starting with who else is working with you, how many people you've targeted in this area, and exactly how sophisticated your operation actually is." Derek stared at her with a mixture of fear and complete incomprehension. What are you?" Margaret set down her coffee cup and met his eyes with a gaze that had once been used in interrogation rooms from Kabul to Kiev. "I'm someone who was really hoping retirement would stick this time. If you've made it this far and you're hungry to know what happens next, how Margaret handles this situation, who Derek is really working with, and what dark secrets are about to surface, then make sure to subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think Margaret should do with this criminal. Share this video with someone who loves stories about people who are far more than they appear to be, because what's coming next will show you just how deep this conspiracy goes, and how a woman who the world sees as helpless is about to dismantle an entire operation with the precision of the operative she never truly stopped being. 48 hours earlier, Derek Vaughn sat in a cramped motel room on the outskirts of Asheville, studying surveillance photos spread across the stained bedspread. The Mountain View Inn was exactly the kind of establishment that asked no questions and kept no detailed records, perfect for someone who needed to stay off the radar. Derek was 34 years old, originally from Portland, Oregon, where he had spent his 20s cycling through petty crimes and short jail stints. Theft, fraud, identity schemes, nothing violent enough to earn serious time, but enough to mark him as perpetually unemployable in legitimate work. He had learned early that the system was designed to keep people like him down, so he had stopped trying to play by its rules. His partner, Travis Chen, emerged from the bathroom toweling off his hair. Travis was 29, tech-savvy and blessed with a face that people instinctively trusted. He looked like someone who would help you load groceries into your car, not someone who would rob you blind while you slept. "She's still following the same pattern?" Travis asked, glancing at the photos. "Like clockwork," Derek confirmed. Margaret Calloway, 73, widowed, 7 years. Husband was Robert Calloway, died of a heart attack back in 2018. No children living locally, one daughter out in Seattle who visits maybe twice a year. She walks every evening at 6:30, shops at the Ingles on Tuesday mornings, attends church on Sundays, social media, barely uses it, has a Facebook account but posts maybe once a month, pictures of her garden, mostly. No security system that we can detect, no cameras, locks are original to the house. Travis sat down on the opposite bed, pulling up their operational spreadsheet on his laptop. They had been in Asheville for 6 weeks now, and Margaret was target number 8. The previous 7 had netted them nearly $40,000 in cash, jewelry, and easily fenced items. The scheme was elegantly simple. Travis would identify targets through social media, obituaries, and public records, wealthy retirees living alone, preferably with minimal family contact. Derek would approach them using the Locksmith scam, gain access to assess valuables and security, and then they would return later to execute a clean burglary while the target was out on their predictable routines. Sometimes, if the target kept significant cash or jewelry on premise, they would expedite the process, as Derek planned to do with Margaret. "This one feels different," Travis said, studying the financials they had pulled. "Her house is worth maybe $250,000. She's on a fixed pension. No red flags in her banking that suggest serious money. That's what makes her perfect," Derek replied. "No family nearby means no one checks on her regularly. Fixed income means she's probably got emergency cash hidden somewhere. And women her age, they keep jewelry, heirlooms, wedding rings from deceased spouses, that kind of thing. Plus the house itself is clean, well-maintained. She's got assets, and if she doesn't cooperate..." Derek's hand moved unconsciously to the small handgun he kept in an ankle holster, a Ruger LCP, compact and concealable. "I've never had to use it. The minute they see it, they give up everything. Old people, they're too afraid to fight back." Travis looked uncomfortable. He had signed up for theft, not armed robbery. But Derek had made it clear that Travis's technical skills were valuable but not irreplaceable. If Travis wanted his cut, he stayed quiet and let Derek handle the fieldwork however he saw fit. "When are you going in?" Travis asked. "Tomorrow morning, Tuesday, right after she gets back from grocery shopping. She'll be tired, arms full of bags, guard down. I offered to help, get inside, and we see what we're working with. And I monitor from here. Keep the scanner running, make sure no one's calling police. If anything goes sideways, you get the van and pick me up 2 blocks north. Same as always." Travis nodded, but something in his expression suggested doubt. "You getting cold feet?" Derek asked, his tone hardening. "No, man, it's just 8 jobs in 6 weeks. Don't you think we're pushing our luck? Maybe we should move to a different city, let things cool down here." Derek stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty, except for their white van purchased from an estate sale in Tennessee, repainted with fake company logos that Travis had designed and printed. From a distance it looked completely legitimate. "One more," Derek said. "We do Margaret Calloway, Then we take our haul back to Portland and lay low for 6 months. I've got maybe 60, 70,000 stashed already. One more good score and I'm set for a year. And if something goes wrong, Derek turned, meeting Travis's eyes. Nothing's going to go wrong. She's a 73-year-old widow who probably weighs 110 pounds. What's she going to do? Now face down on Margaret Calloway's living room floor with zip ties cutting into his wrists and his head still fuzzy from being choked unconscious. Derek was getting a very definitive answer to that question. I'm going to ask you questions, Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority that Derek had never heard from someone her age. You're going to answer them honestly and completely. Every lie you tell will make your situation significantly worse. Do you understand? Derek's mind raced. This wasn't possible. He had watched her. She was old, fragile, alone. How had she moved like that? How had she known about the gun? And why was she so calm? Look, lady, I don't know what you think. You came to my home at 9:15 this morning, Margaret interrupted, her tone conversational but carrying an edge that suggested she had done this before. You used a fake locksmith identity to gain access. You're carrying an unlicensed concealed weapon. You sent a message to an accomplice asking if the target was solo. These facts are not in dispute. What I need to know is the scope of your operation. Derek felt genuine fear for the first time in years. There was something in her eyes, not anger, not even hostility, just a cold, clinical assessment, like it was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be dealt with. I want a lawyer, he managed to say. You're not under arrest, Margaret replied. I haven't called the police. This is a conversation between you and me, and how it ends depends entirely on your level of cooperation. You can't just hold me here. That's kidnapping. Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if considering this. You broke into my home with intent to commit robbery. I defended myself. You're restrained because I don't yet know if you pose an ongoing threat. In North Carolina, I have significant legal protection under both Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground laws, so let's not waste time on legal posturing you don't understand. Derek's mind reeled. Who was this woman? I'm going to ask you one more time, Margaret said. How many people are working with you? Derek's mouth was dry. Some instinct warned him that lying to her would be a mistake. Just one other guy, named Travis Chen. Where is Travis now? Motel Mountain View in room 12. What's his role? Tech stuff. He finds targets, monitors, police scanners, handles the research. Margaret nodded, absorbing this. How many targets have you hit in the Asheville area? Derek hesitated, but Margaret's unwavering gaze pushed the truth out of him. 7. You would have been number 8. Names and addresses. I don't remember all of them. Yes, you do. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that somehow carried absolute certainty. And Derek found himself complying, rattling off names and streets from their operational log. Martha Henderson on Crescent Drive, Bill Patterson on Oak Hill Road, Susan and Tom Merrick on Chestnut Avenue. Each name felt like a confession, and Margaret absorbed every detail with the focus of someone taking a deposition. When he finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. All elderly targets, she finally said. All living alone or with minimal family contact. You're predators who hunt the vulnerable. We never hurt anyone, Derek said, and immediately regretted it. It sounded weak even to his own ears. You traumatized them, Margaret countered. You invaded their homes, violated their sense of security, and stole possessions that likely held sentimental value beyond their monetary worth. That causes lasting psychological damage, particularly to elderly victims who may never feel safe in their own homes again. Derek had never thought about it that way. To him they were just marks, targets, numbers on a spreadsheet that converted to cash. What are you going to do with me? He asked, and hated how his voice cracked. Margaret stood, moving to the antique writing desk in the corner of the room. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook that looked decades old and began writing in neat, precise handwriting. That depends on several factors, she said without looking up. First, whether Travis poses an immediate threat to anyone else. Second, whether you've been entirely truthful with me. Third, whether you have the intelligence to recognize that your criminal career just ended and your only path forward is cooperation. You're going to call the cops eventually, but not yet. Why not? Margaret set down her pen and finally looked at him again. Because I need to understand the full scope of what you've done, who else might be involved, and where the stolen property from your previous victims has gone. I need to be certain that when I do involve law enforcement, the case is airtight and every victim has a chance at restitution. You're not a cop, Derek said, certainty growing. Cops don't. You moved like what are you? For just a moment, something flickered across Margaret's face, not regret. Exactly. More like the memory of a life she had worked hard to leave behind. I'm retired, she said simply. From what? From work that makes your criminal operation look like a child playing dress-up. Derek stared at her, puzzle pieces clicking into place. The clinical questioning, the precise physical control, the complete lack of fear, the way she had disarmed and restrained him with movements that suggested extensive training. You're military, he breathed. Or intelligence, CIA. Margaret's expression revealed nothing. What I am is someone who spent 30 years protecting people like the victims you've been targeting. And what you need to understand, Derek, is that I know exactly how to handle situations like this. I know how to extract information. I know how to assess threats. And I know how to neutralize them. Are you going to kill me? The question came out as barely a whisper. No, Margaret said, and Derek felt a rush of relief. That would be disproportionate and illegal. But I am going to ensure you never victimize another person. And right now, that means dealing with your partner before he realizes something has gone wrong and either flees or does something. Stupid, she walked back to him, crouching down so they were eye level. I'm going to call Travis, she said. You're going to tell him that you found significant valuables and need him to bring the van for transport. You're going to speak naturally and not alert him to any problems. If you deviate from this script in any way, I will make sure that every law enforcement agency in 3 states knows exactly who you are and what you've done. Do you understand? Derek nodded, his throat tight. Margaret held his phone up. She had removed it from his pocket while he was unconscious and dialed Travis's number, putting it on speaker. Travis answered on the second ring. Everything cool? Derek glanced at Margaret, who gave a slight nod. Yeah, man, better than cool, Derek said, forcing his voice to sound normal. This lady's got some serious jewelry. Estate stuff. Probably worth 20-30 grand. I need you to bring the van around. Park 2 houses down like usual. There was a pause. You sure? That's not the plan. We were supposed to just assess and come back later. Trust me on this, Derek said. She's out doing her garden work. I've got a clear window. Bring the van. Another pause, longer this time. Derek could almost hear Travis's analytical mind working through the variables. Okay, Travis finally said. Give me 15 minutes. The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down and looked at Derek with something that might have been approval. Well done, she said. Now we wait. What are you going to do to Travis? The same thing I'm doing to you, Margaret replied. Give him an opportunity to make better choices. Derek lay on the floor, his mind spinning through the implications of what had just happened. He had spent his entire adult life being the one in control, the one calling the shots, the predator choosing his prey. But now he understood with crystal clarity that he had never been the predator at all. He had just been too ignorant to recognize the apex predator when he saw one. So what do you think so far? Is Margaret justified in taking matters into her own hands? Would you want a neighbor like her, or does her hidden past make her dangerous? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And stick around, because what happens when Travis arrives is going to show you exactly how a trained operative dismantles a criminal operation without firing a single shot. The tension is just getting started. Margaret watched through her front window as the white van rolled slowly down Maple Ridge Drive. Exactly 14 minutes after Derek's phone call, Travis was being cautious, scanning the neighborhood for any signs of police or suspicious activity. Amateur hour, Margaret thought, but at least he had basic operational awareness. Behind her, Derek remained restrained on the floor, quiet now. She had offered him water twice and allowed him to shift to a more comfortable position, but kept the zip ties secure. There was no cruelty in her restraint, just the practical understanding that threats needed to be contained until properly neutralized. The van parked 2 houses down, just as Derek had indicated it would. Margaret watched Travis step out, dressed in matching locksmith attire, carrying a large duffel bag presumably meant for transporting stolen goods. He looked young and nervous, scanning the street one more time before heading toward Margaret's house. He's here, Margaret said quietly. Remember what I told you. If you want to walk away from this with any chance at a future, you cooperate fully. What are you going to do? Derek asked again. Exactly what I was trained to do, Margaret replied. Secure the asset, gather intelligence, neutralize the threat, and ensure no one else gets hurt. She moved to her front door, opening it just as Travis reached the porch. Her posture was that of a cheerful elderly woman, slightly confused but friendly. Oh, hello, she said, smiling. Are you with the locksmith service as well? Travis looked momentarily thrown off by her presence. Yes, ma'am. My colleague Derek called me too, to bring some additional equipment. Is he still inside? Oh yes. He's in the living room finishing up his assessment. Please, come in. Margaret stepped aside, and Travis entered, his hand gripping the duffel bag with visible tension. She noted the way his eyes immediately swept the interior, cataloging valuables just as Derek had. These two had done this dance before. Derek, Travis called out. You back here? In here? Derek's voice came from the living room, tight with barely controlled stress. Travis rounded the corner and froze. Derek lay restrained on the floor. The components of his disassembled handgun sat on the mantel, and Margaret stood behind Travis with a level of stillness that combat veterans recognized instinctively, the calm before devastating action. Don't move, Margaret said quietly. Don't reach for anything. Don't run. Just listen. Travis's eyes widened. What the hell? Your partner made a significant miscalculation, Margaret continued. He assumed I was an easy target. I'm not. Now you have a choice. You can cooperate, answer my questions honestly, and potentially walk away from this with your life intact. Or you can make the same mistakes he did, and I'll handle you the same way. Travis looked at Derek. Man, what did you do? Nothing, Derek protested. I don't know what she is, but she's not normal. She moved like military or something. Travis's analytical mind was clearly working through scenarios. He was smarter than Derek. Margaret could see that immediately. He was calculating odds, assessing exits, trying to determine if he could overpower an elderly woman. Before you do something regrettable, Margaret said, reading his body language with practiced ease. Understand that I've spent more years in tactical situations than you've been alive. I was disarming threats before you were born, and I'm very, very good at it. You're bluffing, Travis said, but his voice lacked conviction. In response, Margaret moved, not aggressively, but with purpose. She stepped to her bookshelf and removed a hardcover book, a hollowed-out copy of Anna Karenina, that revealed a small, secure compartment inside. From it, she withdrew an identification card in a plastic sleeve, yellowed with age but still clearly readable. She held it up for Travis to see. Central Intelligence Agency, Case Officer, Margaret Elizabeth Calloway, clearance level, TSSCI. The photograph showed a younger Margaret, maybe early 40s, with shorter hair and eyes that carried the weight of things seen and done. Travis stared at the ID. That's fake. Has to be it's real, Margaret said, returning it to its hiding place. Issued in 1991. Valid through 2003 when I retired. I spent 30 years conducting operations in 17 countries. I've handled asset recruitment, counterintelligence, and threat neutralization at levels you cannot comprehend. So when I tell you that I know exactly what I'm doing, believe me. Travis's face had gone pale. Why are you even here? Why would someone like you retire in Ash? Because I wanted peace, Margaret said simply. I wanted to garden and read and live quietly without looking over my shoulder. I wanted to be just Margaret, not Case Officer Calloway, and I've succeeded at that for 12 years. Until we showed up, Travis said quietly. Until you showed up, Margaret agreed. And now I have to decide what to do about you. She gestured to the couch. Sit, hands where I can see them. We're going to talk. Travis complied, moving slowly. Margaret positioned herself where she could observe both men, simultaneously, a tactical arrangement that gave her optimal response time if either of them attempted something foolish. I need you to understand something, Margaret began, her tone shifting to something almost professorial. You two have been operating under a fundamental misconception. You believe that targeting the elderly makes you smart predators. You think that age equals vulnerability, but you've forgotten something crucial. The generation you're victimizing lived through things you can't imagine. She moved to her writing desk, pulling out the notebook where she had documented Derek's confession. Your targets. Martha Henderson, 78 years old. You know what Martha did before she retired? She was a federal prosecutor who helped dismantle mob operations in 3 states. Bill Patterson, 81, former Marine who served 2 tours in Vietnam. Susan Merrick, 75, emergency room nurse who handled trauma cases for 40 years. Margaret looked at both men steadily. You weren't targeting helpless victims. You were targeting people who had already survived far worse than you could dish out. You just caught them off guard in their own homes, in spaces where they had earned the right to feel safe. That's not clever. That's cowardice. Travis looked down at his hands. We needed money. Everyone needs money, Margaret countered. That's not a justification for terrorizing people. There are programs, resources, legitimate work. You chose the easy path, and now you're discovering it wasn't easy at all. Derek spoke up from the floor. So what happens now? You said you weren't calling the cops yet. Why not? Because I need to ensure that every one of your victims gets justice, Margaret explained. That means recovering stolen property, documenting your crimes thoroughly, and making sure the case against you is so airtight that a conviction is guaranteed. I can't trust local police to handle this with the depth it requires. So you're going to, what? Investigate us yourself? Travis asked. In a manner of speaking, Margaret picked up her modified smartphone, the one that Travis had no idea contained capabilities far beyond consumer technology. I'm going to do what I was trained to do, collect intelligence, verify information, and build a case. And you two are going to help me. Why would we help you? Derek challenged. Because the alternative is far worse, Margaret said flatly. Right now you're facing multiple counts of burglary, fraud, and weapons charges. That's serious but manageable with a plea deal. But if I determine that either of you has been violent with previous victims, or if I find any evidence of additional crimes you haven't disclosed, I have contacts who could ensure you face federal charges with mandatory minimums. She let that sink in. However, she continued, if you cooperate fully, give me access to all your records, help me locate stolen property, and provide testimony about your operations, I can recommend leniency. I can help ensure that your victims are made whole, and I can give you a chance to serve your time and actually rehabilitate instead of cycling back into the system. Travis looked at Derek. Some silent communication passed between them. How do we know you'll keep your word? Travis asked. You don't, Margaret admitted. But consider your options. You're already caught. The evidence against you is substantial. The only question is whether you make this worse or better for yourselves." There was a long silence in the living room. Outside, Maple Ridge Drive continued its peaceful suburban routine, oblivious to the life-altering decisions being made inside number 47. Finally, Travis spoke. "What do you need from us?" Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite relief, she was too experienced to trust a surrender this quickly, but a sense that the immediate crisis had passed. "Everything," she said. "Laptop records, photographs, plans for future targets, every detail about your operation, and most importantly, the location of property stolen from your previous victims. Most of it's been fenced already," Derek said. "We've got a guy in Knoxville who moves jewelry and electronics. Name and contact information," Margaret said, her pen poised over her notebook. As Derek provided the details, Margaret felt an old, familiar sensation settling over her. The calm focus of an operation in progress, the methodical gathering of intelligence, the strategic planning that turned chaos into order. She had promised herself when she retired that she was done with this life, done with the weight of responsibility, the constant vigilance, the necessity of thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else. But as she sat in her living room, documenting the confessions of 2 criminals who had intended to make her their victim, Margaret realized something profound. You never really leave the work. The work becomes part of who you are. The training embeds itself in your nervous system, your decision-making, your very perception of the world. She had retired from the agency, but the agency had never retired from her. And right now, sitting with 2 would-be predators who had found themselves comprehensively outmaneuvered by a 73-year-old woman they had dismissed as helpless, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 12 years. She felt useful. "All right," she said, closing her notebook. "Here's what happens next. Travis, you're going to bring me your laptop and all operational materials from the motel. Derek stays here, restrained, as insurance that you return. If you run, I contact every law enforcement agency in the region and you become a fugitive. If you return with everything I've asked for, we move to phase 2, which is," Travis asked, "we recover the stolen property, document everything properly, and then, and only then, we involve the police with a complete package of evidence that ensures justice for your victims." Travis stood slowly. "You're really going to do all that?" "I am," Margaret confirmed. "Why?" Derek asked from the floor. "You could just call the cops right now. Why go through all this?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "Because I spent 30 years working in a system that often moves too slowly, that sometimes lets people fall through the cracks, that doesn't always protect the vulnerable the way it should. I have the skills and the knowledge to do this right, to make sure your victims are genuinely helped, not just processed through a system. And I made a promise to myself when I retired that if I ever had the chance to do real good without the bureaucracy and politics that sometimes constrained me before, I would take it." She met Travis's eyes. "So yes, I'm doing this and you're going to help me. Not because you're good people, you're not, or you wouldn't have targeted elderly victims, but because you're smart enough to recognize when you've been beaten and when cooperation is your only rational option." Travis nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll get the materials. Give me an hour." 45 minutes, Margaret corrected. "If you're not back by then, the deal is off." After Travis left, Derek looked up at Margaret from his position on the floor. "You really did all that stuff?" he asked. "The spy stuff?" "Yes. Did you ever, kill anyone?" Margaret's expression became unreadable. "That's not a conversation we're going to have. Why'd you retire?" "Because there's a shelf life for field operatives. You either burn out, die in service, or recognize when it's time to step back before the work destroys you completely. I chose the third option. Do you miss it?" Margaret looked toward the window where afternoon sunlight filtered through her carefully tended garden, roses and hydrangeas, and the quiet beauty she had cultivated as a counterbalance to a career of shadows. "Some days," she admitted. "Some days I miss the clarity of purpose, the sense that what you're doing matters on a scale beyond yourself. But most days, I appreciate the peace I've built until today," Derek said. "Until today," Margaret agreed. She checked her watch. Travis had 42 minutes remaining. "Thank you so much for staying with this story so far. If you've made it to this point, you already know this isn't just another crime story. This is about transformation, justice, and the incredible truth that people are never just what they appear to be on the surface. The best is yet to come." In the next chapter, you're going to see exactly how Margaret executes an operation with the precision of someone who never truly left the field. So stay right here, because what's coming next will show you what happens when training, intelligence, and determination collide with criminals who never saw it coming. We're approaching the climax, and you won't want to miss a single moment. Travis returned in 38 minutes, carrying his laptop bag and a cardboard box that Margaret recognized as containing operational materials. She had watched his approach from the window, noting his body language, shoulders hunched, gait hesitant. This wasn't the confident young man who had entered earlier. This was someone who had finally grasped the gravity of his situation. She let him in without a word, directing him to place everything on the dining room table. Derek remained restrained in the living room, a constant reminder of what happened when you underestimated Margaret Calloway. Everything's there, Travis said, his voice subdued. Laptop has our full targeting spreadsheet, communication logs, photos of previous hits. The box has fake IDs, the equipment we use for the Locksmith scam, and financial records. Margaret began examining the materials with the methodical precision of someone conducting a forensic investigation. The laptop revealed exactly what Travis had described, a spreadsheet detailing 8 targets in the Asheville area, complete with daily routines, asset assessments, and security vulnerabilities. But as she scrolled through the files, something caught her attention. Additional folders labeled with city names: Greenville, Chattanooga, Knoxville, Roanoke. "How long have you been running this operation?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Travis swallowed hard. "About 8 months. We started in Greenville, moved to other cities when things got too hot." Margaret opened the Greenville folder. 15 targets. Chattanooga 12 targets. Knoxville 9. Roanoke 11. 55 total victims, she said, and it wasn't a question. "We never hurt anyone," Travis said quickly. "I swear, you terrorized 55 elderly people," Margaret interrupted, her calm demeanor cracking slightly. "You stole from them, violated their sense of safety, and moved on to the next city before law enforcement could establish patterns. This isn't petty theft. This is a coordinated criminal enterprise." She stood, pacing now. Her mind was already working through the logistics. 55 victims across 5 cities meant multiple jurisdictions, which meant bureaucratic complications that could take months or years to untangle properly. Victims who might never see justice. Property that might never be recovered, unless someone with unique skills and connections intervened. "Here's the new situation," Margaret said, making a decision that she knew would pull her deeper into operational mode than she had planned. "This is no longer something I can hand over to local police with a neat bow. This requires coordination, investigation, and resources that go beyond a single jurisdiction." "What are you going to do?" Derek asked from the living room. Margaret looked at both men. "I'm going to make some calls." The number Margaret dialed was one she had promised herself she would never use again. It connected her directly to a secure line at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, specifically to the Office of Personnel Security and Coordination. A woman's voice answered after 2 rings. "Verification code. Songbird-7-7-Delta November," Margaret said, reciting the emergency contact protocol that had been embedded in her retirement agreement. It identified her as a former case officer making contact for security-relevant reasons. "Stand by for authentication." 30 seconds of silence, during which Margaret knew her voice was being analyzed. Her identity verified against biometric records maintained for exactly this purpose. Authentication confirmed. Margaret Calloway, retired case officer, inactive status since October 2003. "What's the nature of your contact, ma'am?" "I need to speak with someone in criminal liaison. I've inadvertently intersected with a multi-state criminal operation targeting elderly civilians. I have 2 suspects in custody with evidence of 50+ victims." Another pause. "You have suspects in custody. Have you contacted local law enforcement?" "Not yet. I'm calling you first because I believe this requires coordinated response across multiple jurisdictions, and I have expertise that would be wasted if I simply hand this off to Asheville PD. Hold, please." The hold music was mercifully brief. When the line clicked back live, it was a different voice, male, younger, but carrying authority. "Miss Calloway, this is Agent Mitchell with the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division. I understand you've encountered a situation." "That's correct. Can you describe the circumstances that led to you having suspects in your custody?" Margaret provided a concise briefing: the Locksmith scam, Derek's attempted robbery, her defensive response, the discovery of the broader operation. She kept emotion out of it, delivering facts with the clinical precision of an operational report. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end. "Ms. Calloway," Agent Mitchell finally said, "I need to be very clear about something. What you're describing, detaining suspects without law enforcement authority, places you in a legally precarious position." "I'm aware," Margaret replied. "I also have TSSCI clearance that, while inactive, hasn't been revoked. I'm offering to cooperate fully with federal authorities on a case that spans multiple states and involves systematic targeting of vulnerable populations. I can provide suspects evidence and investigative support, or I can call 911 right now and let the Asheville Police Department handle 2 suspects while the remaining 53 victims in 4 other states never see justice." Another pause. Margaret could almost hear the mental calculations happening. "What exactly are you proposing?" Mitchell asked. "Bring in a team. I'll turn over suspects, evidence, and everything I've documented. But I want assurance that this will be handled as a comprehensive federal case with victim services, property recovery, and proper prosecution. These people targeted the elderly specifically because they assumed no one would fight back. I want them to be proven spectacularly wrong. You want to be involved in the investigation. I want to ensure it's done right," Margaret corrected. "Miss Calloway, with all due respect, you've been retired for over 2 decades. Field protocols have changed. Technology has evolved, and frankly your age. Stop, Margaret said, her voice taking on an edge that made Travis and Derek both look up sharply. Let me be very clear, Agent Mitchell. I successfully conducted operations in hostile territories before you graduated high school. I've recruited assets, run surveillance, and handled threats with tools far more primitive than what's available now. My age is irrelevant. My experience is not. So you can either accept my assistance and expertise, or you can explain to your superiors why you turned away a gift-trapped multi-state case because you assumed a retired case officer was too old to contribute meaningfully. Silence, then unexpectedly, a low chuckle. Understood, ma'am. Give me 2 hours. I'll have a team from our Charlotte field office at your location. Can you maintain security on the suspects until then? They're not going anywhere, Margaret confirmed. And Miss Calloway, thank you. What you did here, that took courage. It took training, Margaret corrected. Courage was trying to retire in the first place. The FBI team arrived in 1 hour and 43 minutes, 2 agents in a dark SUV, followed by a white van that Margaret recognized as a mobile forensics unit. She had given them her address and a security briefing about the situation inside. Agent Rachel Torres and Agent David Park entered her home with weapons holstered but clearly ready. They were young, professional, and visibly surprised when they encountered a 73-year-old woman who had to restrain suspects and a dining room table covered in carefully organized evidence. Ms. Calloway, Torres asked, her tone respectful but cautious. That's correct. You'll find Derek Vaughan on the living room floor, hands restrained with zip ties. Travis Chen is seated on the couch, unrestrained but cooperative. Neither pose an immediate threat. Park moved to secure the suspects while Torres approached Margaret directly. I'm going to need to ask you some questions about the circumstances here. Of course. Would you like coffee? I've kept a fresh pot going. Torres blinked, clearly thrown by the domesticity of the offer in the midst of what was essentially a hostage situation. Ah, sure, thank you, as Margaret poured coffee in her kitchen, where just this morning she had been reading a thriller novel and planning her grocery list. Torres reviewed the evidence on the dining room table with increasing astonishment. This is ... incredibly thorough, Torres said. You documented everything. I was trained to be thorough, Margaret replied, handing her a mug. Every detail matters when you're building a case. I've documented their confessions, mapped out their operational timeline, identified their offense in Knoxville, and compiled victim information across 5 cities. Park joined them, having secured both suspects in the back of the SUV. Miss Calloway, I have to say, this is one of the most unusual crime scenes I've ever processed. You effectively conducted a counterintelligence operation in your own home. It's what I knew how to do, Margaret said simply. Torres's radio crackled. Torres, this is Mitchell. What's your assessment? Torres pressed the transmit button. Sir, the scene is secure to suspects in custody. Evidence is extensive and professionally documented. Miss Calloway has essentially handed us a complete investigation. Is she willing to provide a formal statement? I am, Margaret confirmed, speaking toward the radio. I'm also willing to assist with victim identification and property recovery if you need someone with investigative experience. There was a pause. Then Mitchell's voice came back, carrying a note of something that might have been respect. Ms. Calloway, I'm going to make some calls. What you've done here might help us dismantle a criminal operation that's been active across the Southeast. We're going to need extensive debriefing, but I want you to know that your actions today have likely prevented additional victims and provided justice for people who thought no one was listening. Margaret felt an unfamiliar sensation, something warm in her chest that she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Purpose, recognition, the knowledge that her skills, even in retirement, still mattered. Thank you, Agent Mitchell, she said quietly. Over the next 6 hours, Margaret's quiet home on Maple Ridge Drive became a command center. Additional FBI personnel arrived. Forensics teams photographed and cataloged evidence. Victim services coordinators began making calls to the 55 people who had been targeted. Margaret sat at her dining room table, providing detailed statements, answering questions, and offering insights that came from decades of investigative experience. She showed them techniques Derek and Travis had used that matched patterns from social engineering scams she had studied during her active years. She helped them understand the psychological profiling the criminals had employed to identify vulnerable targets. As evening fell, Agent Torres approached Margaret with a cup of tea, a small gesture of respect that Margaret appreciated. We're going to be here for a while longer, Torres said, processing everything. But I wanted to thank you personally. My grandmother was scammed by someone like this 3 years ago. She lost her wedding ring, her savings, and her sense of security. She was never the same after. I'm sorry, Margaret said sincerely. That's why this matters so much. You didn't just stop the criminals. You validated that our elders are worth protecting, worth fighting for. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. She was exhausted, more tired than she had been in years, but it was a good tired. The exhaustion that comes from using yourself fully, from applying every skill and every ounce of experience toward something meaningful. As the FBI team continued their work, Margaret stepped out onto her back porch, looking at her garden in the fading light. The roses she had tended so carefully, the peaceful sanctuary she had built for herself after a lifetime of shadows. She had thought retirement meant leaving that other life behind completely. But standing here now, feeling the satisfaction of a successful operation, she realized something important. You don't have to choose between peace and purpose. Between the person you were and the person you've become, you can be both. This story is almost at its end, but the resolution is going to leave you with something powerful to think about. If you've watched this far, it means you're invested in Margaret's journey, in understanding what it means to never give up your strength even when the world expects you to fade into the background. Please, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button if this story has moved you, if it's made you see elderly people differently, if it's inspired you to recognize that power and competence have no age limit. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age? Do you have elders in your life whose strength and history deserve recognition? And most importantly, stay tuned for the final chapter, because Margaret's story isn't just about catching criminals. It's about reclaiming identity, finding purpose, and showing the world that some fires never go out. They just wait for the right moment to burn bright again. 3 weeks after Derek Vaughan rang her doorbell, Margaret Calloway sat in a conference room at the FBI's Charlotte field office, reviewing the final case report. Agent Mitchell sat across from her, looking both impressed and slightly overwhelmed by the scope of what her intervention had uncovered. 55 confirmed victims, Mitchell said, sliding the summary across the table. Combined losses of approximately $380,000 in cash, jewelry, and property. Thanks to the evidence you provided and your detailed documentation, we've recovered about 60% of the stolen property from the fence in Knoxville and various pawn shops across the region. What about the victims themselves? Margaret asked. That had been her primary concern throughout the investigation. Victim Services has contacted every single person. Many of them didn't even realize they had been targeted. The operation was sophisticated, enough that some victims believed they had simply misplaced items. Others who did report thefts to local police had their cases dismissed as routine burglaries with no pattern connection. Until now, Margaret said. Until now, Mitchell confirmed. Because you recognized the pattern, documented everything properly, and insisted on a comprehensive federal response. Ms. Calloway, I want you to understand something. This case is going to result in federal prosecution with significant sentences, but more importantly, it's going to serve as a template for training law enforcement to recognize and respond to elder-targeted crime rings. Margaret absorbed this quietly. What about Derek and Travis? Both accepted plea deals. Derek Vaughan will serve 12 years federal time. Travis Chen 8 years with credit for cooperation. They'll also be required to participate in victim restitution programs. By the time they're released, every victim will have received compensation either from recovered property or from court-ordered payments. Do they understand why what they did was so harmful? Mitchell leaned back in his chair. I think Travis does. He's been remorseful in ways that seem genuine. Derek is more complicated, but both of them have confirmed that the experience with you being completely outmaneuvered by someone they assumed was helpless fundamentally changed their perception of who deserves respect and who poses real danger. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. Good. There's one more thing, Mitchell said, pulling out a folder. We've been authorized to offer you a consulting position. Margaret looked up sharply. Excuse me, the FBI's Elder Justice Initiative needs people with exactly your skill set. Not fieldwork. We're not asking you to go operational again, but training, case analysis, victim services, protocol development. Your experience from the CIA combined with your, let's call it your practical demonstration of how to handle these situations makes you uniquely qualified. I'm 73 years old, Margaret said, though even as she spoke she felt something stirring inside her, interest, possibility. And you're sharper, more capable, and more effective than most agents half your age, Mitchell countered. This would be part-time, fully remote when possible, with occasional travel to Quantico or Charlotte for training seminars. You'd be setting your own schedule and working on cases that matter. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her garden, her book club, the peaceful retirement she had built so carefully. But she was also thinking about Martha Henderson, Bill Patterson, Susan Merrick, and the 52 others who had been targeted simply because criminals assumed they were weak. I'll consider it, she said finally. But I need time to think. Take all the time you need, Mitchell said. The offer stands whenever you're ready. Margaret returned to Asheville that afternoon, driving her sensible sedan through the mountain roads she had come to love. When she pulled into her driveway on Maple Ridge Drive, she noticed something unusual. Her neighbors, people she had exchanged polite pleasantries with for 12 years but never truly connected with, were gathered on her lawn, and they were applauding. Margaret stepped out of her car, confused. We heard what you did, her neighbor Carol called out, a genuine smile on her face. The FBI told us about the criminal ring you stopped. Margaret, you're a hero. I just did what anyone with my training would have done, Margaret protested, but she was smiling despite herself. You did what needed to be done, Mr. Patterson from 3 houses down said. He was 84, a Korean War veteran, and Margaret had always suspected he had his own stories buried beneath his friendly demeanor. And you proved something important, that we're not done yet, that we still matter. The gathering turned into an impromptu neighborhood celebration. Someone brought out lemonade, someone else had cookies, and for the first time in 12 years, Margaret found herself truly connecting with the community she lived in, not as retired Case Officer Calloway maintaining a low profile, but as Margaret, a woman with extraordinary skills who had used them to protect people when it mattered most. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Margaret sat in her garden with a cup of tea, watching fireflies begin their evening dance among the roses. Her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. Miss Calloway. The voice was elderly, female, and carrying deep emotion. My name is Martha Henderson. I was one of the people those men robbed. The FBI told me it was you who caught them. Hello, Martha, Margaret said gently. I'm glad they reached you. I wanted to thank you, Martha continued, her voice breaking slightly. After they took my mother's ring, the only thing I had left of her, I felt so violated, so helpless. The police told me it was just gone, that I should move on. But you didn't let it go. You got my ring back. Margaret felt her throat tighten. I'm glad I could help. Can I ask you something? Martha said. How did you do it? How did you stay strong? Margaret thought about that question carefully. I think we're all stronger than we realize, she said finally. Society tells us that getting older means becoming invisible, becoming vulnerable, but that's not true. Every year we survive, every challenge we overcome, every loss we endure, it doesn't weaken us. It builds us. You're strong too, Martha. You survived what happened to you, and you're still here. I don't feel strong, Martha admitted. Neither did I for a long time after I retired, Margaret said. But strength isn't about feeling powerful all the time. It's about knowing that when the moment comes, you'll do what needs to be done. And Martha, you reported what happened to you. You didn't stay silent. That took courage. They talked for another 20 minutes, and when they finally said goodbye, Margaret realized something profound. This was what she had been missing, not the adrenaline of field operations or the complexity of intelligence work, but the direct human impact of using her skills to help people who needed it. 2 days later, Margaret called Agent Mitchell. I've thought about your offer, she said. I'd like to accept, but with conditions. Name them. First, I want direct contact with victims when appropriate. Not just case files, but real connections with real people. Agreed. Second, I want to help develop training programs specifically for teaching elderly people practical self-defense and security awareness, not making them paranoid but empowering them. That's actually brilliant, Mitchell said. I'll get budget approval. And third, Margaret continued, I want recognition that expertise and capability don't expire just because someone reaches a certain age. I want the FBI to actively recruit consultants from the retirement community, former military, former law enforcement, former intelligence. There's a wealth of experience being wasted because we assume people over 65 have nothing left to contribute. There was a pause. Then Mitchell spoke, and Margaret could hear the smile in his voice. Miss Calloway, I think you just outlined a new initiative. When can you start? 6 months later, Margaret stood in front of a room at the Asheville Community Center, looking at 30 elderly faces watching her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She had been invited to teach a workshop on personal security and awareness, the first public application of her new consulting role. My name is Margaret Calloway, she began, and I'm here to tell you something important. You are not helpless, you are not invisible, and you are not easy targets. She saw skepticism on some faces, interest on others. Earlier this year, someone tried to rob me. They chose me because they assumed my age made me vulnerable. They were wrong. And over the next 2 hours, I'm going to teach you why they were wrong. Not through my skills specifically, but through principles that anyone can learn and apply. She moved through topics methodically, recognizing social engineering scams, trusting your instincts, maintaining environmental awareness, simple physical techniques for creating escape opportunities. But more than techniques, she taught mindset. You have survived decades of life, she told them. You've handled challenges, overcome obstacles, raised families, built careers, endured losses. Every one of those experiences built strength you may not even recognize you have. What I'm teaching you today isn't new power, it's helping you recognize the power you've always had. By the end of the session, the skepticism had transformed into something else. Pride, recognition, a sense of reclaimed agency. An 80-year-old woman approached Margaret afterward. I've been afraid to leave my house since I was scammed last year, she admitted. But listening to you today, I don't feel afraid anymore. Good, Margaret said, squeezing her hand. Fear is useful when it protects us, but it should never paralyze us. As autumn turned to winter, Margaret found a rhythm that balanced her peaceful retirement with her new purpose. She tended her garden and attended book club, but she also consulted on FBI cases, developed training materials, and taught monthly workshops on security awareness. She was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about elder-targeted crime. She helped develop victim services protocols, and she became an advocate for recognizing that the elderly population represented not vulnerability, but vast reserves of experience, wisdom, and capability that society had been systematically undervaluing. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, her doorbell rang. Margaret checked the security camera she had installed, a practical upgrade that made sense for someone who now consulted on security matters. It was Agent Torres, holding a bottle of wine. "Is this a social call?" Margaret asked, opening the door with a smile. "Semi-social," Torres admitted. "I wanted to update you on something. Remember how we talked about your case becoming a template? Yes, the FBI just announced a new national initiative called the Elder Justice Task Force. It's using everything you helped us develop: training protocols, victim services, interagency coordination, and they're recruiting consultants from retirement communities across the country, just like you suggested." Margaret felt a swell of emotion. Really, your name is literally in the program documentation as founding contributor." "Margaret, you didn't just stop to criminals. You changed how the entire federal law enforcement community thinks about and responds to elder-targeted crime." They shared the wine and dinner, talking about cases and life in the unexpected ways that purpose can find you even when you think you've hung up your operational identity forever. After Torres left, Margaret stood in her garden under the winter stars. The roses were dormant now, but they would bloom again come spring, just as she had bloomed again after years of dormancy. She thought about the life she had built, the peace she had found, and the purpose she had reclaimed. You don't have to choose, she realized. You can be both the person who wants tranquility and the person who fights when fighting matters. You can retire from an organization but never retire from being yourself, competent, capable, and unwilling to let injustice stand unopposed. Margaret Calloway had spent 30 years protecting people in shadows across the world, and now, in her 70s, she was doing it again, but this time in daylight, in her own community, making a visible difference that she could see and touch. Some stories end with retirement. Margaret's story had simply entered a new chapter, and this chapter, she decided, might just be the best one yet. So what do you think? Could you have done what Margaret did? Do you have someone in your life, a grandparent, a parent, a neighbor, whose strength in history deserves recognition and respect? Margaret's story shows us something we often forget. Power, intelligence, and capability don't disappear with age. They evolve, deepen, and wait for the moment when they're needed most. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the elderly people in your community, if it inspired you to see beyond assumptions and recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary, then please, take a moment right now and tell me in the comments, what did you think of Margaret's story? What's your name, and what city and state are you watching from? I want to hear from you, from every corner of this country, from people of all ages who understand that we're never done growing, learning, and contributing. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another incredible story of ordinary people with extraordinary depths. Hit that like button if Margaret inspired you, and check out the next recommended video appearing on your screen right now. Another story that will challenge everything you think you know about strength, courage, and the human capacity to surprise us when we least expect it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and remember, never underestimate anyone because you never know what battles they've already won.